ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very special guest. We have the co-founder of OwnHome, James Bowe, here with me today. For those of you who don't know, OwnHome is a solution for all those first home buyers out there who don't quite have a deposit saved up to buy a property. James and his team have found a great solution to home ownership, basically making home ownership and the dream of home ownership come true for those that don't feel like they can quite afford it yet. It's been a great success story thus far. That I think their first customer was November last year, and already within less than 12 months, they've got the likes of CBA investing into them, Square Peg, that venture capitalist fund, who's backed by the original founder of Seek. I think they've got a valuation of over $100 million already within 12 months. Great success story because it's a business and a service offering that works, right? It's finding a niche in the market that the market needs. So James, welcome on board.
Theo, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So before we get carried away into the T's and C's of this amazing offering that you've come to market with, OwnHome, in a nutshell, what is it? What's the vision? What are you hoping to achieve for the marketplace? Tell us all about it.
So in a nutshell, OwnHome is a new path to home ownership that allows folks to save towards their home while they're living in it. And we deliver on that new path to home ownership through what is known as a rent-to-own pathway to home ownership. So we buy the property outright on behalf of our customers. And so what that looks like for our customers is that they're approved for a buying amount by OwnHome. They then direct us to the home that they want purchased off the open market. We go and buy that property for them, taking care of all of the pricing negotiations, the due diligence of that property, and then they move into that property. And each month, they're making monthly payments, a portion of which are going towards the accumulation of a deposit towards that home. And then they're able to buy that property back from OwnHome at a pre-agreed price. And so that's fundamentally the OwnHome pathway to home ownership. And so who are we here to support? It's really fundamentally folks who don't yet have that accumulated deposit, or perhaps they have those savings but don't want to, sell all of their share portfolio and pour all of that into property.
That's a great solution.
And so fundamentally, who is that in Australia? It tends to be folks who don't have access to the bank of mum and dad, or don't want to rely on the bank of mum and dad and put their parents in that position. And so today, that's millions of young Australians. So 4.5 million young Australians don't own the home that they live in. And so we're set up to support all of those Australians who don't have access to or don't want to rely on the bank of mum and dad, but want to achieve the security that comes with home ownership.
That's amazing stuff. That's fundamentally fantastic is what I should say. That's a solution that the marketplace needs. It's amazing that a solution like that hasn't come to market sooner, and I think it's going to provide. I know since we've been in partnership together, Shore Financial and OwnHome, I've made comment of this solution as a partner of ours, and straight away people start asking more questions and want more information. So that's fantastic. So tell us the story. It's inspire some of our listeners with some of the journey that you went on. Where did it all start from? Where did the idea of finding a solution? Well, I guess before we say that, why don't we talk a bit about what the solution actually is, and then where did the inspiration come from to find that solution?
So OwnHome is a new path to home ownership that allows folks to save towards their home while they're living in it. It's as simple as that. And it's an innovation that's incredibly mature overseas. So in the UK, Canada, the US, rent to own is an incredibly important part of those governments and those nations' sort of housing affordability programs. But it's just never existed here in Australia at any sort of scale. And I spent a lot of time overseas. I spent 6 years in San Francisco and was really fortunate there to see that model up close. I myself actually almost used rent to own as my path to home ownership in San Francisco, but actually just decided not to because I came back to Australia to launch OwnHome with Tim, my co-founder. And so we were both overseas at the time and made our way back here.
All right, so yeah, that's a pretty interesting story, James. So why don't you tell us a bit about the actual solution and how the offering works and how it can help people in Australia make dreams come true of home ownership as such.
So maybe I'll talk through the customer journey and what that looks and feels
Mm,
like to bring it to life. And it's really 4 simple steps is the path to home ownership with Own Home. Step 1 is applying to Own Home. And so we're asking the same questions at step 1 as any bank. Based on your income and expenses, what can you afford on a monthly basis? And
mm,
that's going to determine your buying power with Own Home. Step 2, you're approved with Own Home up to a buying power. We might say, Theo, based on your income and expenses, you can afford a $1.4 million home. And so we'll begin that home buying journey to find any home on the open market, the national sport of domain and realestate.com.au. We then, step 3, buy that property for you on the open market, and you enter into an option and lease agreement with Own Home. And that gives you the right, but not the obligation, to buy that property back from Own Home at a pre-agreed price. And step 4 is buying that home back from Own Home at that pre-agreed price. And so during your time with Own Home, you're making monthly payments, and 35% of those monthly payments are going towards the accumulation of savings towards that home. And when I say
credits as such.
exactly, so building up that
Mm.
deposit effectively over time.
So for all those people that right now feel like they're consuming money in rents and it's hard for them to save up a deposit because they need to rent a home, they might have kids and whatnot, and they can't live with parents as some first home buyers are doing to save up a deposit. At least they're getting recognition for the rent they're paying.
Exactly right. I wish that over the past decade and a bit that I've been renting in Sydney or elsewhere, I had have had something like this pathway to home ownership that was giving me credit towards being able to buy that home at a future point when I was ready.
That's great. And I like the fact, I think a good point to highlight there is that you're doing the qualification and assessment before you recommend the product or solution as such to make sure that they can actually then afford to buy the property afterwards.
Exactly right. Ultimately, we're not a replacement for a mortgage. We're a stepping stone towards a mortgage. So all of our customers, unless they come into some fantastic inheritance,
Mm,
are eventually going to need a mortgage to finance that property and
mm,
buy it back from Own Home. And so we're really fundamentally focused on understanding if you had a deposit, what size mortgage would you be able to access?
mm,
And then we need to go a level of conservatism above and beyond that. So none of our customers are suddenly going to be able to buy a more expensive home than they otherwise could if they had a deposit. And I think that's a really important thing to remember from Own Home. We're solving the deposit hurdle. We're not solving the serviceability challenge. So if you can't afford a mortgage on a monthly basis, you're not suddenly going to be able to take the Own Home pathway to home ownership. We're really focused on that deposit hurdle to home ownership.
That's a really good shout because I think some people feel, why is someone buying a property if they don't have a deposit? Well, they have to be able to afford to buy the property.
Yeah, I also think that taps into a really important point, which is there's almost a misnomer out there in Australia that if you don't have the deposit, then you're not a great credit-worthy bet for a mortgage
Mm.
provider. But the reality is that the majority of first homeowners, successful first homeowners in Australia, today rely on the bank of mum and dad.
Yeah, the bank of mum and dad has really underestimated the marketplace. I feel a lot of people out there probably don't realize how many people are probably getting support from the bank of mum and dad. I don't mean in the form of guarantor loans. Yes, that's one solution, but a lot of parents can't afford to do a guarantor loan. Might not have a property with enough equity, or might have too many children to support them all in that same format. The other solution that most parents, I think, end up falling to is providing a cash contribution to their children in the form of a gift. And I feel like some first home buyers underestimate how much that gift is really making a difference. They're worried about the repayments, but I sometimes say, hey, you wouldn't be able to buy this property without the gift. So, and that's where I guess you step in.
It's exactly right. Like the gap we see in the market is really, if there's 60% of first homeowners who rely on the bank of mum and dad, it's supporting the 40% of first homeowners who get there in terms of saving that deposit over time and sort of serving those folks sort of like T minus 2, T minus 5 years from when they're in that position to have saved up that deposit without the support of the bank of mum and dad. And sort of I reflect on my own experience and path to home ownership. Grew up on the Central Coast, one of five, super idyllic upbringing, but definitely no bank of mum and dad support there to provide that couple of $100,000 that you need to actually have a deposit for a home in Sydney. Or I think of Tim, my co-founder, now a happy OwnHome customer. I'm sure there were probably simpler paths to home ownership than building a business to support Tim into his own home, but small mission accomplished there.
100%. On that note, I'm going to quiz you here whether you know the stat to this. Do you know what the average age of a first home buyer is in Australia?
Well, I know that the average age of the first homeowner in Australia has gone up dramatically over the past few decades. So once upon a time, about 40 years ago, it took around 2.5 to 3 years in the workforce to be able to save a sufficient deposit to own your first home. And that has now increased to between 10 and 12 years in the workforce to be in a position to have a deposit to own your own home.
Which is mainly because the ratio of the income earned compared to the house price you need to pay has also blown out too, right?
Exactly right. So, maybe our parents' generation remember the time of interest rates being 17% and sort of cite that as an incredibly burdensome time. But the reality is that the deposit hurdle over the last 50 years in Sydney has increased 50 times. And so that's the dynamic that our generation is now facing when they're contemplating making their way onto the property ladder.
I always say to that generation that always remind us of those 18% interest rates. I'm like, yeah, but you bought a property with like a bag of rice, right?
Exactly.
So let's just go back to that comment because I do know, well, last time I looked at it, the average age of a first home buyer is 40 years old.
Wow.
So when they talk about, the bank of mum and dad, you're not talking about 20-year-olds using mum and dad straight out of uni to buy a property. The average is a 40-year-old person who 40% of them are actually buying as dual applicants as well, which probably also leads me to what my next point about the Labor government scheme that released when was the election? April, about helping first home buyers buy a property where you co-own a property with the government, and the fact that it's capped to those income hurdles of, I think it's 90 grand for an individual and 120 grand for dual applicants, which at 40 years old, if you're looking at buying a property, it's quite hard to qualify, which is great for you guys because you don't have those same caps, right?
Well, I think the bringing up the Labor government policy in the election is a really interesting sort of point to dive into. What I think we lived through was an election where cost of living was front and center of that election campaign. And specifically, the cost of home ownership was front and center. And we saw both parties coming up with their own versions of innovative solutions that were squarely focused on the deposit hurdle. So there was effectively, bipartisan recognition that the deposit hurdle has become the barrier to home ownership. And it felt like, the major parties were throwing the kitchen sink at how do we come up with innovative solutions that support folks getting into their own home. And so effectively a recognition that something's broken when, the median deposit for a home in Sydney is $350K when you include stamp duty. And so how do we support folks onto the home ownership, ladder? What we see though, and you call out rightfully there, is the caps. So those programs support a subset of the Australian community, but there's a huge gap in terms of folks that earn really great incomes, have fantastic credit track records, but still don't have the couple of $100,000 that you need to make it onto the property ladder.
But they're very credit-worthy applicants.
Exactly right. So like I reflect on, the OwnHome app, folks that we serve today, average credit score of 800. So these are folks that impeccable track records in terms of creditworthiness, but just need support in saving up that deposit.
So great solution. Understand I guess the appropriate audience for a solution like this. My next sort of question would be, the terms and conditions, T's and C's. There's some real great opportunities, you could say, for applicants or purchasers as such, first home buyers that use OwnHome, because they get the privilege of hindsight in the property market, where you give them, was it a 7-year option?
That's right.
A 7-year option to effectively execute the option and buy the property at any point in the next 7 years once you buy it on their behalf. And they can also just watch how the property market's performed, but then factor in the historical purchase price with a small fixed percentage growth, which it's the beauty of hindsight, right? They get to see that growth and whether it's worthwhile. And you're basically hoping that there's growth, and you're the one taking the risk on their behalf. It's great, right?
Yeah, we're really proud of the customer proposition. When we think about what does home ownership fundamentally mean for folks, and why are people looking to achieve home ownership, it usually boils down to 3 fundamental benefits. And one of those is certainty of tenure. So knowing that you're not going to get kicked out of your home because the landlord's decided to sell the property. And
security.
And the reality is that the average tenant is in their home for 18 months, whereas the average homeowner is in their home for 10 years. And so we see a huge divergence in the experience of security between homeowners and renters. And so security, is one of those important elements. Number 2 is being able to treat that house as a home and being able to invest in that property, and do so with certainty. And so we deliver on that for our customers. So we've got one of our customers has just put a pool into their property. So I'm sure, the first renter, so to speak, that's put a pool into their home.
Yeah, how many tenants out there get to renovate their home and put a pool in if they want?
Yeah, and so more than half of our customers over the past 6 months have already undertaken pretty substantial renovations of their homes. And 3, it's the ability to capture the upside of that property.
That's the big one.
Yeah, and so the outcomes again between renters and homeowners is really stark. So the average wealth of a homeowner in Australia is 20 times greater than that of renters. Of course, not all of that is attributable necessarily to home ownership, and there's some causal correlation differences there, but it is a really stark difference in outcome. And we all know that it has been one of the major drivers of wealth creation here in Australia. And so fundamentally, that's what we're focused on delivering and pulling forward those benefits of home ownership. So security, the ability to invest in that home, and fundamentally the ability to capture the upside. And happy to sort of maybe to your T&C's point, double click into what does that mean?
Yeah, so someone finds a home, they don't have the deposit, they want to buy it, they engage OwnHome, you buy it on their behalf as such. They're a tenant with an option for 7 years to purchase at any point with that fixed capital growth at, what was the rate?
So the fixed capital growth rate is 3.8%.
3.8.
So the price, the pre-agreed price, is the price that OwnHome buys it for on day one, not including stamp duty. So if we buy $1 million home, the starting price is $1 million.
But when you say we, it's a property that they've found.
That's right. That's exactly right. So completely directed by the customer. Although importantly, OwnHome is taking care of the contract negotiations, the due diligence on those properties. And that's been a really surprising source of delight for our customers.
Support.
And this is the first time that this first homeowner is confronting this process. But actually, it's the umpteenth time that OwnHome is going through this process. And so we started OwnHome with this observation that there was this financial and legal structuring solution that was possible to bridge the deposit gap. But what we've gone on to observe is just how much opportunity there is to transform that home buying journey. And today, that home buying journey for a first homeowner typically looks like, on the one side, someone going through this process for the very first time in their lives, pitted against someone who sees it as their role to agitate actively against their interests. So the vendor's agent. And so how do we sort of tip the balance back in favor with just some, negotiation 101, some proper due diligence, and our customers have been really delighted to have that trusted advisor in their corner, helping them navigate.
Someone who actually cares about their situation that they can trust.
Exactly. And it really boils down to incentives. And the incentives are clear. OwnHome for a period of time is, the title holder of this property. And we want to make sure that we're securing on behalf of our customers great homes at really great prices. And we're fundamentally aligned on making sure that we're really confident that this is a great investment for OwnHome and a great investment for our customers.
I love your passion and your vision statement there as such. You're clearly driven by the outcome for the consumer, which, behind every successful business is a founder that has that attitude. So let's elaborate a bit more on that 3.85% fixed capital growth on the purchase price that they pay. That's actually quite generous of you in the sense that if you probably look historically at the property market, especially in Sydney, and call it a 50k radius to the Sydney CBD, most of those markets probably have a much higher annual capital growth average. Do you actually know what that is, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so we wanted to make sure that we priced OwnHome in a way that was disproportionately likely to generate fantastic financial outcomes for our customers. And so when we put forward the OwnHome proposition to developers, they look at the pricing structure and say, you're leaving so much money on the table if we look at the historical performance of OwnHome. And our response is, that is the point. The point is that we want there to be an immense amount of sort of area under the curve, so to speak, that our customers capture. And so our customers, when they buy that property back from OwnHome, just to be clear, capture all of the upside above that 3.8% growth rate.
So let's give an example of that. So someone could have come to you and said, we want to buy this apartment in Bondi or whatnot. That they've paid $1 million for it. Well, OwnHome, writes the check and buys the property for them for $1 million. There's that 3.8% growth per annum on the property, but that property in say 3-4 years might be worth 1.3, 1.4, maybe more. And the difference in what they have to pay you and what the property's worth is actually straight capital growth in their pocket.
Exactly right. If we look at just the last 7 years, what would that have looked like for purchasing the median-priced home in Sydney? And so the median-priced home was about $910,000. 7 years later, that property is now worth $1.47 million on the open market. And so you have the right to buy that property back from OwnHome at around $1.2 million, less the deposit that you've built up. So you've got to finance about $1 million. And so then you've captured all of that upside. So that's about 270 grand there of captured capital gain.
So you get a fixed capital growth that OwnHome wants to basically charge for your costs as such. The buyer picks up any capital growth above that, which historically is definitely higher than that 3.8%, which is great. In that example, what did you say on the average property in Sydney? It was 270 growth in the last $270,000 growth in 7 years.
Well, it's actually much more substantial. That was the incremental capital growth that they've captured, but it was about $500,000 of capital growth over that period of time.
Yeah, sorry, 270,000 was the amount they would earn after paying the costs associated with the product. And just to highlight, there was 35% of rent, was it?
So 35% of your monthly payments
Yep.
are going towards your deposit each month. And so that's globally, OwnHome is the longest option period of any rent-to-own model. We're really proud of that. It's also the highest amount of monthly payments that goes towards the accumulation of that deposit. And it's also the lowest locked-in rate of price growth.
Yeah.
And this is in a market where historically Australia has been an incredibly resilient property market. And so there's no, we're going through one of the many downturns that we've seen over the past century.
That's a perfect segue actually to what I was about to say. Everyone's saying the property market's falling apart. At this price point of, the target market as such being first home buyers, the gloom and doom correction that we're seeing, it's a less than a 5% reduction probably on the price.
That's what we've seen so far. What I'd say about the current state of the market is I certainly have no practical advice for folks that are looking to buy their fifth or sixth negatively geared property. That's a different risk proposition to the folks that we're looking to support. Who we're really looking to support are folks that are owner occupiers who are really committed to putting down roots in a particular community and aren't viewing this as like a financial option. They're viewing this as their path to home ownership. To deliver on those three fundamental benefits of security, the ability to invest in their home, and the prospect of being able to capture capital upside.
The path to home ownership is the best phrase you could say to use.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
But touching on the resilient property market, everyone, just going back to that point, everyone's thinking that you're getting a 10, 20% discount right now, and it makes people procrastinate about making decisions like this. Something that I feel some clients that we see in our business over the years are constantly looking for external factors to make their own internal decision, and they've got to let go of those external factors and realize right now probably is a perfect time to look at something like OwnHome, because I feel your 7-year option agreement is pretty well aligned to 7-year cycles in the property market. And even if we see another, couple percentage points of negative sort of growth, you could say, in the property market over the next 3 to 6 months, over the next 7 years, it's the path to home ownership, which will drastically outweigh those, 1 or 2 percentage points.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Previously we were seeing customers apply to OwnHome with deep feelings of FOMO, fear of missing out. And what we're seeing that replaced by at the moment is more like FUD. So fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And what has shifted is this sense of like, I need to get into the property market yesterday, and every day that I'm not in the property market is costing me money.
And overnight it changed.
And overnight it changed. And what that's been replaced with is a sense of uncertainty about where to from here, and what is the right price to pay for a property, and what are my reference points, and what negotiation power can I bring to bear. And so it's been really interesting to be the steward for our customers through that period of fear, uncertainty, and doubt at the moment. And to your point, like you would reflect on 2021 as a potential homeowner and say, you're probably in a better position to be buying in 2022, but it doesn't feel that way. In 2021, that felt like the best possible time to be getting into the market.
Because every day the prices were going up. I love that analogy there from the FUD, from FOMO to FUD, basically, is what happened overnight. And it's funny, you're spot on. 2021 was probably not the ideal time to buy with prices going so crazy, because it was probably the peak of the market. And now this FUD market that we're in now, which is purely consumer sentiment, I think it's really worthwhile highlighting that, yes, rates are rising, but rates are normalizing. I think the appropriate language to use around interest rates at the moment is that the interest rates we had the last 2 years were emergency rates. They were rates to stimulate the global economy, because it wasn't just our local centralized bank that slashed rates, but all over the world, central banks slashed interest rates. And we're just going back to normalized rates where they were 3-4 years ago. And the average homeowner can afford those rates because banks have been assessing affordability at much higher rates the entire time. And I've got some data that we actually released on household savings through the last, or it was actually data on household savings for the last 20 years. This relates to homeowners because it's mortgage data. And most mortgage holders in the last 2 years accumulated a lot of savings because of low interest rates. Hence why we have an inflation problem, because consumer spending went up with all these additional savings. So I think this little window of the FUD of lack of confidence in the market, I think it's going to be short-lived. And if someone can use your services to get in the door of a property that they can see themselves living in for the indefinite future, I think it's a great opportunity as such.
No, thanks, Theo. But to your point, I think there's some more at play, which is like, I think if the average aspiring homeowner is carrying votes in terms of like how many votes can they put towards the intended purchase, and what we've seen with the rising rates over the last few months is that voting power has certainly been reduced. And so we're seeing a natural gravitational pull and drawback as a result of some of those RBA moves. And there's some genuine understandable uncertainty and doubt when we've seen a RBA that promised to never raise rates until 2024 and then reverse that policy 6 short months later.
Yeah, and people saying they want Philip Lowe's head off the back of it.
Yeah.
No, I understand that uncertainty. And look, even though, to my point about rates normalizing back to where they were, people did have a bit of a shock when their repayments started going back up again, because they overnight got used to the lower repayments as well.
Yeah, I saw a stat the other day that said 30% of mortgage holders didn't expect rates to go up when they took out a mortgage. And I think there's a lot of value in the stewardship provided by Shore Financial and brokers, and just being really explicit about what it is that they're signing up to. Because at the end of the day, a mortgage is a fairly complicated product, and it's really important and valuable to make sure that you've got sort of an independent advisor that's capable of being a steward, not only at the outset, but also, of course, for making sure that you're in a position to refinance and,
the duration of your commitment to that property and mortgage. Because, on the point of refinancing, the people need to realize they've got to maintain income, and they can't just, have a good year of income, buy a property, and then later might not hit their same bonuses or KPIs and think, oh, she'll be right, when they actually, those bonuses and that income was factored in for the loan approval in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's a hefty credit obligation. And I think, maybe an interesting point of distinction about OwnHome, which is that it's not a credit obligation. So it's the option to buy that property back at that pre-agreed price, but it's not a recourse credit obligation like a mortgage. And that's a really novel proposition in the Australian market.
Yeah, that is a great proposition. Actually, it just made me trigger a thought there. So your the rental repayments would probably be similar to the principal and interest repayments that the mortgage holder or the OwnHome customer would have to sort of take the step into, from being the tenant to the homeowner as such. So I guess it's like a testing period if they're comfortable with it, right?
Yeah, like you can almost think of it as like the training wheels version of a mortgage. And why I think CBA was, really excited to back OwnHome. If you look at the profile of folks that we're supporting, they're eventually the ideal mortgage customers, and they're actually going to have 3, 5, 7 years of this track record of making the payments that are equivalent to the mortgage payments. And so, what better basis to make an informed sort of credit lending decision than folks who have built up that track record and that sort of training wheels period.
And the best thing about that, they also have the get out of jail free card. That if they find the mortgage or the rental payments, too costly, and they're not comfortable with committing to the purchase, they can just walk away, right?
Yeah, like it's not a part of the proposition that we
Want to
deeply
promote?
emphasize,
Yeah,
which is this try before you buy
yeah.
notion. But it is a really important element of the own home proposition, and I think it's why rent to own is a really suitable path as a replacement for things like LMI or really high LVR or loan to value ratio mortgage solutions, because those are credit obligations that you're taking on with very little equity contributed. And so that's an element of why we're really excited about rent to own as a suitable solution for folks who don't yet have that deposit build up, is that they're not taking on a 30-year credit recourse commitment.
It makes me think, why haven't there been these type of solutions sooner? What's been the hurdle? We heard your beautiful journey of where the inceptual idea as such came from, but why haven't things come to similar offerings like this come to market sooner?
Yeah, it's really difficult to pinpoint any single factor that's been the barrier to rent to own.
So nothing's changed as such.
Nothing has necessarily changed per se, but what we've certainly seen over the past decade is that there's been an appetite of capital providers to back innovative financial solutions, Afterpay from, 0 to, $39 billion exit in less than a decade. A very capital intensive business. That certainly wasn't possible probably in the decade preceding the birth of Afterpay.
So I guess something has changed. The investor market of backing fintech type businesses like yourself has changed, and you wouldn't have the business you've got today without the support of people like CBA and Square Peg and whatnot.
I think that's exactly right. So that's one of the ingredients. I think another important ingredient is that the deposit hurdle has actually become so incredibly burdensome. And so that's reached some form of tipping point and recognition that it's no longer sufficient to, say, she'll be right, when the reality is that the majority of folks are relying on the bank of mum and dad to actually bridge that deposit gap.
The necessity of a product like this in the marketplace has also grown.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's next, I guess, I feel you've got all the ingredients to hit the lights out in terms of growth. Is there any big goals for OwnHome as a business at the moment? I believe, are you just focusing on the New South Wales market?
So we're actually now live in New South Wales, Brisbane, and the Gold Coast. So
wow.
Now operating across 2 states, and ultimately in the near term focused on cracking sort of the entire East Coast market. Our goals over the next sort of few years are really to ensure that this path to home ownership is made available as an option to as many aspiring homeowners as possible. And our company vision is to support more homeowners in Australia than any other business. And so we've got our work cut out for us, as I think that mantle is currently held by CBA, supporting somewhere between 30 and 40,000 homeowners per year. But that's the mantle that we're looking to take on. And we know that rent to own is only going to be, one part of that journey and pathway ahead. But we know that there's a need for more customer-centric, problem and solution-oriented businesses that think outside the box and really work backwards from how can I deliver a delightful customer experience rather than how can I, maximize the dividend payout to my shareholders.
That's also, I feel like, a change in the marketplace globally, where businesses are definitely focused more on being the best possible customer outcome as their point of difference, right? I think in the past it was all about profit, and people will probably less emphasize on service. But with things like Google, Facebook, and all these platforms that you can rate a business and rate the service, businesses in many industries have become so service driven, right? You can't do a bad job by someone in your industry or in your business as such, because you'll get slandered online, right?
Exactly right. And I think we've also seen some of those innovations come through in the mortgage industry. So
100%.
there's been that loyalty tax that's been
Yeah.
widely acknowledged, which is if you're not actively seeking out refinance opportunities, you're almost certainly paying more than you should. And so we've seen players like Athena, also a Square Peg backed fintech, who've come along and their proposition is that they proactively ratchet down the rate that you pay because the risk profile is reducing over time as your LVR is improving.
I have to say, we also do the same thing here at Shore Financial. We have a sleep soundly promise, which we give annual reviews. But it's not just Athena in the marketplace. Just to go back to this goal of the East Coast, because I like the vision as such. But I'm curious. So you say the East Coast. If someone wants to buy a house in Mudgee, are you funding their house in Mudgee?
Good question. So we're focused on today, areas that have historically been incredibly resilient. And so that has disproportionately been the inner ring of Metro Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne. There's been lots of, newspaper inches written about the transformation of work from home arrangements and the growth of regional centres. But that has historically been a more volatile, higher risk.
More of a speculative investment as such.
Yeah, that's right. And so not to rule it out, but today, where are we focused and where are we best placed to support with the existing OwnHome proposition? It's in places that have historically had really consistent and solid capital growth over a long enough time period.
Yeah, it's also because in those markets, property is basically, not just in the markets, across Australia. Australians have that, dream of home ownership. In other places like America, I feel when people, save up some savings from a successful career or whatnot, they tend to turn towards the share market to invest their savings. Where here, as soon as someone starts saving up or has some savings as such, they want to buy a property, or if they can't afford to buy a property, they look at organisations like yourself. But the home ownership is such a big focus in Australia, and Australians see home ownership or property as such as actually an asset class to invest in, right?
That's exactly right. Although I would say that, Australia has one of the lowest home ownership rates amongst the OECD.
Oh, really?
Countries.
Very interesting.
And so while it's definitely a part of the national psyche, and I'm sure that's a consequence of, folks seeing the wealth creation opportunity that represents, it's in some ways just a really natural consequence of, like, if you think of Maslow's hierarchy, and shelter is right at the bottom of that. And if you're not spending money on a mortgage, you're spending money on rent. And so it's this known sort of cash outlay that you'll have to be spending. And so it's a really natural and understandable desire to make sure that that's at least paying some of those dividends around security or the ability to invest in it, or that it's this wealth creation engine.
Security, I think, is the big one, right? If you feel that you can at least have a part of your monthly commitment going towards a home that you own, so that, at the end of your, say, 20-year, 30-year journey in the workforce, you hopefully own your property outright, and that property's worth, fivefold what you paid for it. That's a, plan to retirement that people can easily sort of imagine as such.
Exactly.
All right. Well, James, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on board. I'm sure our listeners are going to be delighted to hear more about this. Best things to do, I guess, we've got a page on our website outlining more of your details and how the offering works. What's the process if people want to get in touch? It's just a quick, 5-minute phone call? Is it online? What's next if some of our listeners want to take up the service and hear more about the offering as such?
Well, that's exactly right. So on the Shore Financial homepage, there's a Live Now, Buy Later link that'll take you directly through to the OwnHome website. And there, it's as simple as a 3-minute online application process. Doesn't impact your credit score at all. And what that'll reveal is your buying power based on that self-reported income.
Great.
And then you can expect a callback from someone at OwnHome.
And just next steps on that callback, how quickly can you basically get someone ready? If someone has found a property this Saturday and hasn't even spoken to you yet, how quickly can you turn it all around for them?
Yeah, so right now it's Thursday, so Saturday would be tight. But our record from first call to contract exchanged on behalf of the customer is 27 days. So that's how fast we've been able to move in the past, and
Which you probably find that the average processing, if someone went to a bank, or the average brokerage in the industry, is probably about the same. So what I meant by my question was, if they found a property this Saturday, but in the weeks coming afterwards, they could probably get a application approved and finalised with you to look at purchasing that particular property as such.
Yeah, we'll be able to finalise your buying power within 24 hours, and we're working to make that sort of a 10 to 15 minute process. So it's certainly possible. The actual thing that takes the time after you're approved is making sure you've found a property that you love. And there's that diligence element of the property.
So you would suggest, obviously, don't wait until you've found a property. Speak to you first and then go looking for the property. And something you touched on, you'll also then be quite involved in the negotiations, did you say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we're leading the charge on making sure that we're securing that property at a fantastic price. What we've seen is just the ability to reintroduce just some of those like 101 negotiation elements into the home buying process. And so that, we are, a dispassionate corporate face on behalf of our customers who are able to present to vendors, here's the offer, best and final, stands for 24 hours, not here to play tennis.
Wow.
And actually stand behind that.
That's great support. Sorry. Versus,
sometimes the boiled frog experience of a first homeowner who's told, the screws are gradually tightened around, another 10 to 15 should get it done. Actually, I've just had another offer come in, another 25K should get it done. And you don't actually know what you're dealing with, and those processes can drag out over the course of a few days, only to be left dejected and having been strung along.
That's underestimated support in the marketplace. I feel people, think that they've got the confidence to go out there and buy a property, but when it comes down to the crunch of negotiating and putting offers in, and especially the emotions take over, people get quite excited about the idea of that particular property being their new home. And they can get a little bit silly in what they're prepared to pay for that new home and that new chapter of their life as such. So having someone like OwnHome in their corner in the negotiations, especially when OwnHome's interests are aligned to the buyers, where you want to make sure you get it for a good price, because you're going into partnership with the buyer, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Well, that's fantastic. Very exciting stuff. Very happy to see you guys succeeding and providing a solution for not just our customers, but the marketplace and hopefully the whole of the east coast of Australia soon. Maybe even one day in Mudgee, who knows. But thanks for coming on board, James. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Theo, and great to be partnered with Shore Financial on this.
Awesome.